record our 20th episode in our series. That is why we want to dedicate this episode entirely to the problems of international security that await us around the corner. We will discuss climate change, Arctic arms race, nuclear proliferation, and space war. I hope this episode can become a source of inspiration for all of us, and we will overcome this security threats. So, welcome, dear listeners.
20th episode.
Today we're very happy to talk, and we had a long way to record this podcast.
We did.
And I feel really great.
I do as well, I think we're here making progress. I feel like we really progressed since the first episodes.
I know.
And I hope we will progress even more afterwards.
Yes, and I hope you're going to support us, dear listeners.
And we thank you for those listening.
Yeah. So today we want to make something like a special episode discussing threats to international security. And I guess it's also interesting to discuss because, in 20 or 30 years or something like this, we can look back and say what security threats are still important and what we will probably solve.
Yeah, I guess in 30 years, our podcast may be a primary source for historians.
Yes, exactly. So let's jump into the topic, and I would start with the question. So what threats do you see as the most important of our?
Well, I would say the collapse of the unipolar system with one global power being the hegemon, that being the United States.
Yeah.
Well, this situation is obviously declining. We have new powers rising. We have the European Union kind of separating from the United States, and we're slowly reaching a system where we have again the concert of powers.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, it's we talk a lot about this, and people international, specialists in international relations talk a lot about this, and it has a lot of implications on the world economy. This globalization, sort of as it's called. And all this idea that the world will never be the same as it was, 10 years ago, or even, I guess, more 20 years ago. And I guess one of the most distinctive features is this vicious competition that we admire. And, according to all theories, all these multipolar worlds, they're very unstable. And so what kind of should solve this problem, because after when we got nuclear weapons, we still lived in this bipolar system, which is believed to be more stable than multipolar system. And now we have this multipolar system, and we still have nuclear weapons. But there is a big but, so to speak, because we don't know how it will turn out at the end of the day.
Yeah, and the growing competition between powers is very evident. First of all, the United States and China, I think, is the most clear sign of rivalry. Both countries have nukes, as mentioned. Maybe it makes it a bigger risk to security, or maybe it makes it less dangerous because nukes will, discourage use of force.
Yeah, but let's come back to this question maybe a little bit later. Just specifically to arms race, I guess it's another separate threat that a lot of specialists try to warn people and say, you don't really pay attention to world politics, and it's a big deal right now. But let's just come back to this idea of multipolarity, because I just find it interesting how it's going to turn out with the how do you see the role? How do you see the U.S. role in all of this?
I think the U.S. would still like to retain the status of the global power, and that's why they are deteriorating right now. As I think we discussed previously, they overextended a little bit, wanting to be the police officer of the world, intervening everywhere they can. They are still extremely powerful, but if you spread your forces thin, you're just weak in every region. And I think that's what the US is doing right now with the commitments in Europe and the Middle East, now with the growing threats with China. The US might realize that, wow, it's not working, maybe we should withdraw.
It has basically, you're right. And I guess it's also important to mention that the US has two enemies at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
We already discussed this in previous episodes, but I guess it's important to mention this once again because the idea, if you're gonna have a war with two world powers, basically in like European theater, in an Asian theater, this would be probably a disaster for the US.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the US is not capable of waging two wars at the same time.
And this is what a lot of experts warn and say. Well, clearly, like competition with China will not fade away because it's kind of structural, and we just understand like we already have two kind of hegemons, like very big countries with concentration of capital and military power. But then we have Russia, which is like very weak economically, still like very strong militarily. So that's why let's reach Russia the same way Kissinger reached China in 70s and proposed to cooperate on some issues. I also think about it as a little bit hypocrisy in terms of Western politicians because they say, well, we cannot cooperate with authoritarian country, but that's what they did in 70s,
But well, they do it all the time. Just look at the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. Yeah. It's the most important ally of the U.S. in the region of the Persian Gulf. It's a totally authoritarian state that doesn't respect any human rights or whatever. But it's just real politics, and that's really a false narrative that they do not ally with dictators.
I guess this is a shame, honestly, and
it is.
I feel really sorry for this politics. And I mean, you should have a profound hope in Russian people because Russia is still a part of Western civilization. You couldn't deny it. Whatever you say, it has the same roots, Christianity and stuff. And you should have a hope because people maybe one day going to turn to democracy, and you should just deal with the Russian government the way it is now, as it is, because.
If the approach of the Western world is like the American Russophobic or especially like the other countries in Eastern Europe who are extremely Russophobic, then I think that their chances for Russia to turn democratic are very, very low because the Russian society will have the notion of threat from the outside because look, the US is so anti-Russian and they probably want to undermine our authority and attack us. So we have to be ready. So we need a strong government.
Yes, that's what Putin utilizes in order to usurp power and gain popularity because, I mean, economically Russia is weak and you need to somehow justify all your economic weaknesses through this constant military and all other threats that's coming from the West. And I mean, for me, I feel a little bit frustrated because you can also think about Russia the same way. You can compare, let's say, Russia to Japan in the 30s because it's the same idea. It kind of wants to gain its, wants to assert its power, but it doesn't have like so much capabilities, but it still has something, and this, some capabilities it could use no matter what cost is, and this is dangerous.
So would you say that Russia will be like forced to go into some kind of armed conflict in the near time?
I would say this is one possibility, and especially that can happen, in European theater. Some, small war can occur basically in Baltic states. I don't want to say Poland, but it's still probability because they act in a close proximity with each other. And, all this latest news that I guess, like, not Poland didn't say anything officially, but American ambassador in Poland said, well, if Germany doesn't want to hold American nukes, then Poland maybe can do this because Poland is really dedicated to alliance. And I see the solution to this problem probably counterbalance of European powers thinking strategically and thinking together, as European Union create some European military alliance and just have enough power to have its own agenda with Russia.
Well, unfortunately, I think it's hard to have a unified agenda towards Russia and the EU. On one hand, you have Macron, who as he has, he's not pro-Russian, but he wants a new opening with Russia for sure. He sees the opportunities that there could be from cooperation with Russia. But then you have the Baltic states, who they're also in the EU, but they hate Russia and they're afraid. Also, countries like Poland. And then you have Hungary, who is basically an authoritarian state by now, and they're pro-Russian.
And they
so it's Russian. The opinions are super divided within the European Union.
But yeah, I guess, but it's still, I guess, Europe, as I live in Europe right now, and I feel Europe can be way more protected having its own military, its own kind of military force.
Yeah, I
So,
agree. Well, if you combine the forces of
hmm
the European Union, they're almost as
hmm
strong as the US in terms of
and
capabilities and numbers.
yeah, and you don't have this hatred, against like Russia and Europe because Russia and Europe still can understand each other. They still coexist on the same
Yeah, the
continent, and
cultural differences aren't that big.
yeah, and you have a lot of economic, diplomatic ties, and that's the problem with the US. It's they simply don't talk to each other, and the difference between American and European diplomats is that European diplomats still talk to Russia and talk to Russian officials, no matter who they are and what regime they represent. I mean, this is international relations. You couldn't just say, "Oh, it's authoritarian regime." There are so many authoritarian regimes, and they still deal with them, like
Yeah.
China. And no one, I mean, and China is a very different culture, so it is way more authoritarian in terms of society.
Well, the entire history of China is an
Yeah,
authoritarian regime. Even when they were officially democratic, they were still an authoritarian regime. So
yeah. So I guess war is the main concern. It should be main concern in the nearest future, and let's hope we can avoid it.
but do you see it a major global conflict or regional?
I guess, I mean, for me, the main conflict would definitely, I mean, can definitely happen between China and the US.
Mm-hmm.
But this, some they call it entente, they call it some rapprochement between China and Russia is actually a little bit worrying in terms of we don't actually know what they can plan together, and they already have shared military exercises, which is
Yeah.
pretty intimidating. And, I mean, they actually cooperate, and then Russia builds. Early warning system for China, ballistic warning system for China, and this is also something that unprecedented, I guess, for security to give your technology to some potential enemy also because China they have never had like brilliant relationships only after 50s brief period of time between Stalin and
Mm-hmm.
Mao, relationships were good, but after that they almost started nuclear war against each
Yeah.
other in 70s because of like border disputes.
But then
Uh,
again, don't you think that at some point the Chinese-Russian cooperation must stop because
yeah.
in the long run, China has way more potential than Russia. Right now, Russia
hmm
still has the technological edge,
Yeah.
and this is what, for example, arms exporters from Russia are worried about. That if
hmm
we export our technology to China, they're just going to copy it, and
Yeah.
and we will lose the technological edge and the advantage. And this is
hmm
basically when you look at the Chinese fighter arsenal,
hmm
all of them are copies of the SU lines
Yeah.
from the Soviet Union or early Russia. So, would you think
Yes.
that Russia will be reluctant to, sell military equipment to China right now?
I guess it's a big concern for Russia, and there is a lot of probably opposition, even in the Russian military bloc, that we might not, that we are not aware of. But I say that they're really worried about their economy, and when you look at economy and the structure of world economy, they see they couldn't have access to European markets and Western markets, and to have good trade relationship with these countries. So the only country they could cooperate with is China in terms of
Mm-hmm.
economy, and China is the country who actually gives them some economic benefits, and they just like bet on China just because they don't have any other choice. I guess this was like if you remember, there was Financial Times interview with Putin,
Mm-hmm.
and journalists asked him this question: don't you think you put all eggs in one basket, so to speak?
Yeah.
Having good relationship with China and very bad with West. Then Putin answered kind of like tricky way. He said, "Well, we don't have any other choice. We don't have something to choose from." So it was kind of like
Mm-hmm.
clear sign that I mean Russia could cooperate with the West, but I guess Western demands just out of the reach
Yeah, I
for
guess
Russian
this would
officials.
include withdrawal from Crimea and eastern
Yes,
Ukraine and possibly Georgia.
yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, conflict in Donbass, they could probably solve again without American involvement because again, American involvement deteriorates situation.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's actually understandable because average American should not care about Donbass, and average European probably should care about Donbass because it's an important issue for the whole Europe. It's first war in Europe since World War II.
It's just
I mean,
it's just a country which borders the European Union is basically openly at war.
Yeah,
which is something that we didn't see since the Yugoslavian wars.
Yes, exactly. So let's hope for the best. I mean,
let's hope.
We all want to be optimistic, but in order to be optimistic, we should warn people and say, look, we should think critically and don't just trash Russia just because it's an authoritarian country. All these labels, they are unproductive and they don't lead to anywhere.
Yep.
They lead to the further escalation, and escalation can lead to a conflict.
Yep, global security is more important, I guess.
Yeah, so let's switch, I guess, to another topic. Which topic you would like to discuss?
Maybe let's discuss the recent developments in space industry.
Yeah, I guess space industry is an interesting topic.
It is also important for security as well.
Yeah, as we know, they're going to be SpaceX launch.
Yeah, so SpaceX is going to launch the first official crewed flight ever of their company to the International Space Station in late May, which is something huge. First of all, it's the first time that American astronauts will be launched with an American vehicle into space since the space shuttles were retired. And what is more is that it's the first time that a private company will send people into space.
And it's really updated, so to speak, space shuttle with a lot of electronics on board, computers, and
it looks very futuristic.
Pretty fascinating, with a lot of automatics involved in all the process of this. Yeah, I mean, for me, the question in space industry and in broader way space development is like the idea that we could develop space only as entire civilization.
Yeah.
And otherwise, it would be something like similar to space war in 50s, 60s, and 70s. And what I'm worried about with this multipolar world, space can become the realm of competition and not the realm of cooperation as it used to be.
I would even go as far as to say that going back to multipolar worlds might even hinder the exploration of space and space development. Because let's look at the International Space Station. Yeah. No country alone could ever construct such a project. Even if the US, if they increased the budget of NASA to 20% of GDP, they would not be able to do that. And I would even go as far to say this is possibly one of the biggest achievements of humanity.
Yeah.
We saw a lot of cooperation in space, especially after the Americans retired the space shuttle. They relied purely on Russians to send their astronauts to space. And now the Americans want to be independent in this area.
Endeavors,
and also looking how NASA is behind schedule with their lunar programs, they are thinking about dropping the idea of building a new space station around the moon.
Yeah.
I think the space cooperation might be, in danger.
Yeah.
So the idea here was that there would be a big space station in lunar orbit, which would be built both by European Space Agency, Roscosmos, and the NASA. But right now they're thinking about withdrawing from this idea and dropping the idea of a space station entirely. And to me, it's first of all sad.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, it reflects the situation in the international arena right now.
And also we have China, which is also developing its space capabilities, but it doesn't cooperate with anyone.
Yeah, China is an interesting example because they never cooperated with anybody. All their spacecraft are based on Soviet era technology, which was licensed to them. But right now they have ambitions of building their own space stations, their own manned flights. They were the country which landed on the so-called dark side of the moon.
Yeah.
So I see that many countries are doing huge developments on their own, but it's a shame not to see them cooperating because imagine how much they could be achieved by cooperation.
But also the question with the lunar station and lunar resources on the moon is how they're going to be, let's say, legally
divided, right?
Divided, and what would be the legal basis? Because I I mean, the problem also with Roscosmos is that Russia simply doesn't have such a great economy to achieve,
Yeah.
big, because it costs a lot of money. You should have this strategic planning for 10 years, meaning that you should have this budget. I mean, expect to have this budget, and so on and so forth. And what last I read about this lunar station is Roscosmos is basically worried that it won't be organized the way International Space Station is organized. So that basically, we're going to have like one big company, NASA in the US, operating the space station. Another company is going to have access to build their parts, and what they're afraid of, they won't get an access, like they won't control it, so to speak. So they will just grant technologies, but they won't benefit from this, so to speak. And this is like
and Russia, as you said, in terms of economic situation, they do not have enough money for research and development. So all their space technology relies on upgrades from Soviet times. If you look at the current Soyuz spacecraft and the rocket they launch on, if you compare it to the rocket that launched the Sputnik, the R7 rocket, it basically look identical, just an upgraded version.
I mean, moreover, they sell this like one of the most advanced Russian engines is like this RD 180, and they never use it themselves. They just sell it to Americans and who use them, which is, I find, like actually very hilarious and funny.
But this is actually interesting that Russians or the Soviets were the first ones ever to develop the so-called closed cycle engines, which are way more efficient than open cycle engines. They do not waste fuel for the turbines. Let's not get into technical stuff, but they invented it back in the Cold War, and today it's the basis of the rockets that basically the Americans use, what they used on the space shuttle and what they use on the SLS today.
Yeah, so it's a little bit funny that Russians don't have carriers, so to speak, to use these engines, and they have this project, a Federation project, but we never know when they're gonna succeed and when they're gonna have a prototype to launch into the space.
Yeah, Russia has many expenses. They have a huge army to upkeep, and space right now, I think, is their priority.
Yeah, I mean, but it still can turn out very different in the future. They still like leaders in this industry. So I mean, for me, I understand that any sort of cooperation in space is possible, and people kind of are united, and this should be collective endeavors the same way, as Collider in Switzerland is endeavor of European countries and so on and so forth. All this advancement in technology, they could be made through common efforts, and that's how it should be made.
And also, when you look at one of the largest space agencies, which is the European Space Agency, it's an agency which consists of like dozens of countries, which on their own would not be able to achieve anything. But together they can build, modules for the space station and fly astronauts to us, do a lot of science, and on their own they just wouldn't be able to do anything.
Yeah.
And I think it's I still hope that cooperation will be still on in space, but considering the current international, relations topics, I think cooperation in space will deteriorate as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting that in '75 they basically ended this space war between Soviet Union and the US, even though they had different regimes, but they realized and understood that we shouldn't proceed with this vicious competition, which has it's like a limbo. It has no end, only war. Only when there's war.
It's like super interesting to see that at the time when the Vietnam War was slowly coming to an end, the USSR and the Americans could cooperate in space. Even though they were openly hostile on the ground, which is something I can hardly grasp.
I guess which leads us to another topic. It's arms race, and that's what played a major role. SALT negotiations, and I guess in '72, what they achieved is first binding international agreement in terms of a bilateral agreement between the USSR and the US, which basically limited the number of warheads that they could be deployed. Big milestone for international relations and international cooperation, and we now in the same situation when countries develop different types of nuclear vehicles that could bear nuclear warheads. And the thing is, it's actually very dangerous in terms of nuclear weapons somehow acquire new meanings because they don't perform only this function of mutual destruction, but they perform some different sorts of functions, military functions. Just like now they are used and they're supposed to be used in some weapons, like Kinjal is like I guess the best example. It should be on the one hand strategic weapon, but on the other hand very tactical weapon that could destroy American carriers, so to speak. It has nothing to do with mutual destruction, but it can gain you a very big victory in terms of. I mean, it can gain you basically a victory in some war theater.
And this is a huge difference when you look at the modern nuclear warheads. They are way smaller than those used, like for example, in the of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Yeah. And this is because modern delivery methods of nuclear weapons are way more precise. So back in the days in the 50s, you were like, okay, so yeah, we can only drop the bomb, like let's say in the perimeter of like 30 kilometers of the target. So we need to make sure that the bomb is big. So even if we miss by 10 kilometers, we'll still destroy the target. Yeah. Nowadays, those warheads are quite small compared to the ones from the years before, because we have precise ways of delivery. So I could totally see a nuclear warhead being used to wipe out, let's say, a U.S. carrier group from existence.
Yeah, and
which I think, and I mean, this wouldn't even be like any war crime or whatever, because you're not attacking civilian targets. Everybody you kill is a soldier. Yeah. So I could totally see minor let's say escalations to nuclear usage.
And I guess threshold is decreasing in terms of sometimes with like military practitioners, they're not really sure what kind of what missiles, whether they have nuclear warheads or not, because we have some types of missile that can be both, so to speak, dual use. And this is intimidating, and all countries right now have them. I mean, all great powers, the US, China, and Russia, and this is something that we should be worried about. I guess collectively, we should, for example, in the 80s there was like peace movement in like the 70s, and this what to a certain degree, I guess, stopped arms race because people were pissed and they just basically said no to American nukes, for example, in Canada and in other European countries, just because they realize how dangerous it is to store American nukes and endanger your own population this way.
But now we're back to the same topics of arms race.
Same topics. I mean,
the expenditures for defense are rising everywhere. China, US, Europe, everybody's buying more guns.
More guns, and they built way more advanced missiles, especially like Russia.
Russia is really a pioneer in terms of missile technology. If you read reports on the Russian strategy, they rely on strategic and tactical missiles a lot,
which is called on this anti-accessory denial area. It basically means that the U.S. forces could not operate in this area without big losses because of the mainly missiles. Like Iskander-M, I guess, is like a perfect example of...
basically with the usage of Iskander, when basically Russians deploy one unit of those in Kaliningrad, they can basically attack Poland, Germany, Baltic states with no problem without even leaving
they are dual use. It's essentially interesting. They can be nuclear and they can be conventional. If they are conventional, they are already very devastating.
Yeah, and let's imagine that you're the target of the attack and you see that there's an Iskander missile flying your way. You're like, and you have to think, does it have a nuclear warhead or not?
Yeah, because
do we have to put our population into underground to save them?
This is very tricky. This is very tricky, and that's why I guess I want people to think about this. To follow up news and just people do think about some concerns. For example, yes, climate change is a big concern for everyone, but it's not the case for arms race. But this is like the same kind of threat that endangers everyone. Just because chain of reactions can lead us to nuclear war, just because some minor conflict in South China Sea led to some missile exchange, and one of those missiles, turned out to be nuclear. Whatever.
I agree with you that people do not give enough attention to possible security risks and military news. You never know how fast it can escalate.
As they have never thought about viruses as a big security threat.
No, man. If you asked me 1 year ago, do you think that there will be a global pandemic in 1 year? I would tell you, come on.
Yeah, but actually interesting that in 2019 they had something like exercises. American army or not army, American government, they had exercises, and they had like this big convention in Johns Hopkins predicting, the possibility of viruses, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but still, no one was prepared in terms of the scale,
No
and
one. And
yeah.
also, I think the current pandemic also demonstrates something interesting. Is that the more radical leftist groups who are like like super pacifist
Mm-hmm.
and anti-military, I think it might show them something because right now the militaries all over the world are
Mm-hmm.
used to combat the virus spread.
Yeah.
The medical services of
Yeah.
army are used, and soldiers deliver aid.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this shows that modern armies are still needed, and
Yeah.
even if you do not use them for combat with other countries, they're crucial to
Mm-hmm.
security of the state,
Yeah.
because you can have a natural disaster,
Mm-hmm.
and sure, you can have the police, you can have the firefighter departments,
Yeah.
but sometimes you need a more stronger and specialized force to
I agree.
combat disasters.
But also, I guess it's kind of evident now that it's crucial to have your own, masks and your own production of these things. It's just like also because I guess for a long for a decade it was normal to have everything from China, but now we understand how
Yeah.
crucial to have your own production. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, now if you say I support like national production, there's nothing wrong with this. I mean, you should protect your own country first of all. You shouldn't think about China getting rich when China is hiding information and just basically behaves very badly.
Yeah, but before, people had no problems with buying stuff from China in huge
Hmm.
numbers, because there was this idea that if China gets rich enough, it will turn
Yeah,
democratic.
and it failed.
But I think by now everybody believes that it's not possible.
Yeah.
So we see this movement of stop buying from China, buy
Hmm.
from local manufacturers,
Yeah.
stop
Support
buying.
them.
Yeah, just if you have someone in your town who produces shoes by hand, just buy from
Mm.
them. Don't buy
Mm.
from some huge factory from China which
It makes
exploits
sense.
workers. Which I personally like, personal opinion, I think it's good.
Yeah, I also think it's good just because you should sustain. I mean, just the notion that globalization, in a way that it existed before, I would say 2008 crisis, going to exist after 2000 crisis is just stupid because like the system just crashed
Oh, it
and like
did.
there is. I mean, it's also interesting discussion because I saw this. It's not a meme, but people said, I guess it was Chinese, probably Chinese propaganda. They said, "Will Americans pay for 2008 world crisis the way they request us to pay for Corona?" I mean, it's a tricky question. Yes, I mean, but Americans definitely bear responsibilities for this crash.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's just the
Um,
greed of the stock
yeah,
markets and
they
stuff.
crashed the system, and so many people lost their jobs worldwide, just not because of their own country, just because they relied on the US.
Well, the US did it twice in history: 1929 and 2008.
I guess 2008 though was more. It had way more impact on world markets because
Yeah, yeah.
connection to.
I mean, 1929, it
Yeah,
sort of got you Hitler into power, so.
yeah, and they just gave so. I mean, they produced so much stuff in Germany also, and gave money to Hitler Germany. I guess in the 30s. Also
Yep.
very interesting. Well, I guess we have a few topics to cover. I would like to discuss Arctics in terms of climate change because I guess one of the main concerns in terms of climate change that it has an impact on security.
Mm-hmm.
In one way, it has impact. A very big impact is Arctic, and it changes. I don't like this word, but it changes geopolitics. Because we have new trade routes which are way more efficient than previous trade routes. We have like, a lot of resources in Arctic, and countries start just basically fighting for them. It's also a little bit intimidating and terrifying because they couldn't figure out whose this land is, and um,
It's tricky.
it's tricky. But it's the case already because we see, I mean, mainly it's Russia, the US, Arctic countries, and try to figure out the way how to live there together,
Mm-hmm.
coexist. I mean, Russia is not only the pioneer in the Arctic, but they have the most number of how do you call it? Icebreakers,
Icebreakers, yeah, the ships, you mean.
and a lot of nuclear powered icebreakers, and they're very advanced in this region just because of, I mean, obviously their territory,
Yeah.
and they have a lot of like part of Arctic is just like Russian territory, and it makes sense that they put a lot of efforts. But it's interesting how it's perceived, as we thought, well, we don't have a lot of territory to fight for, but now we have something, and this is also somehow correspond to this multipolar world, to this nuclear instability, so to speak. Have you had any thoughts about that?
The climate change and geopolitics is a super interesting topic because the climate change might actually benefit some countries.
Yeah.
For example, if you look at China basically relies on exports on its economic power. And right now, let's say you want to send a ship from China with goods to Europe. Let's say you want to reach Great Britain. You send a ship from mainland China. You have to swim through Indonesia, then navigate around India, then either go through Suez Canal or swim around Africa. But now let's imagine that the global temperature rises and the ice caps in the north melt. China then has a complete new route to get into Europe. And it's way faster and it's way more efficient if you have no ice caps in the north. So this may, basically globally everybody says, yes, we're committed to stopping the climate change. But maybe for countries such as like China, maybe it's not beneficial to stop the climate change.
We know that world capitalism is greedy. It's not, but it benefits not only China, but mainly all European countries because they all have routes with connection. I mean, they all have some trade with China.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Even Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and all countries, basically all European countries benefit from them. The only one who doesn't benefit from them is the US, honestly, and that's why they're so worried. And the US doesn't have a control over the Arctic. And nobody has, but there's some countries that are very successful. And I mean, Russia controls this, how it's called, like North Route.
Well, they have their shoreline along.
Yeah, they have very firm, I would say it's firm control, because like now route that they have is basically into Russian economic zone, goes through Russian economic zone. And that's why Russia, feels great about this, because they're gonna earn a lot of money, and it's for them it's really good, and it's also why probably they cooperate with China, because they want to earn money through this route.
Which is just sad that something as basic as climate can be a matter of politics.
But we shouldn't take our world for granted. I guess
no, absolutely not.
The mistake of pre-crisis 2008 crisis was that our world going to be the same for eternity, and this is the same idea as the end of history. We're just like going to live the way we live right now.
When you look at history, people always thought that took the reality for granted. Like after World War I, everybody said, "Okay, this was the war to end all wars, and we'll have no more, global conflicts." Oh well, it didn't work out, and I think people really too often take reality for granted, even though there's historical evidence that world changes even when you don't expect it.
It changes rapidly. Okay, I guess we covered Arctic.
I guess we did.
The last topic, maybe let's talk about nuclear proliferation, something that we also covered in our episodes. And we have, the worst case scenario is that Iran going to get the bomb. I guess it's almost...
Sooner or later, they will.
Yeah, and this means, the complete change of nuclear proliferation in Middle East, because once Iran gets bombed, all other countries are going to say, well, now we need our own bomb, and it's going to be probably Saudi Arabia, and some other countries are going to worry about, well, maybe I should get my own bomb as well, And this is something that, it's not so terrifying, because, proliferation of nuclear weapons, the way it is controlled now, probably going to, the regime going to fade away, and probably we're going to end up with a world where more powers are going to get nuclear weapons eventually. I guess this is also the problem probably of nuclear non-proliferation treaty and just regime. It kind of like stops the time in terms of, you can get like really advanced powers like Germany, let's say Brazil, even India back then, which like are not allowed to develop their nuclear weapons, but even though they're probably responsible actors and they probably have
big influence,
rights, to have these weapons. Why not?
Well, Germany is a tricky question. Germany, first of all, they do not want nuclear weapons right now.
I mean, no one wanted to give them this right, so.
Yeah, history.
But now it's very different now when we have this. I mean, Germany doesn't really want to have, I guess, its own nuclear weapons. It's tricky.
Especially if they oppose stationing of American nukes in Germany, then why would they want their own, right?
I mean, there is this concept of Euro nukes that's going to be developed commonly with France.
I think France right now wants to be the major nuclear force in the EU.
I mean, they're very advanced, and
very potent.
If you look at the redistribution of nuclear energy in Europe, I guess almost 60% goes to France. It's actually impressive.
And Germany is actually also moving away from nuclear energy.
Because they're very worried after Fukushima.
And Chernobyl.
I mean, which I don't really understand, because it's definitely, sun works on the same principle and basis. Why would you confront and just try to prevent this scenario for the future of generations?
I mean, still, nuclear energy is the most efficient we have.
And the most clean. I mean, one of the most clean.
It's just, you have to store the nuclear waste, which is really doesn't take up too much space. But people were afraid after, those disasters.
Very afraid, especially Germany. But for me, I guess it's the promise of humanity to have to develop, and we just need to put a lot of efforts, I guess, and what scientists do in order to develop safer nuclear reactors and new generation nuclear reactors. And
in terms of energy, in terms of nuclear energy, it's still super efficient. But in the current legal framework, it's expensive because you need to spend a lot of money for security measures.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just more beneficial to build a wind farm instead of a nuclear power plant, because you would have to spend so much money on safety measures that is just not beneficial. I guess we will cover this in a different episode dedicated totally to energy, because it's a huge topic. It's a very huge topic. It's a huge topic globally, and it's important for international relations.
But you couldn't, I mean, the thing is, you couldn't rely on this renewable sources, so you couldn't just build your energy supplies just from, how do you call them again? Renewable sources. You should have some other sources, just because the system is unstable, and it just like every specialist in this field gonna say you this, but when you go to some climate activists, they just say no, it's you should be dependent on solar energy, which is not a very efficient.
I know some experts who say that it's possible to have 100% renewable energy, but
it's not reliable.
It's not super. I guess we'll cover this in a different episode.
I guess we covered everything that we wanted.
Yes, at this special episode.
And thanks for listening to us.
As always.
Subscribe to our Spotify channels on different platforms. Spotify.
And YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, everything. And Twitter. Don't forget Twitter.
Yeah, you can engage with us actually on Twitter, and we really promote, if you want to have some kind of conversation about topics that we cover, just shoot us a message on Twitter.
And if you want some news that you don't get from your mainstream news, also Twitter.
And stay safe.
And hear from you next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.